Glad you're joining us. We are live on Facebook, being recorded. A lot of times people do really appreciate being able to go back to the recording and hear about, kind of what was said and replay all the content. It's very important content. Thanks again, everybody, for being here. It always motivates and enlivens me to see that people really care about trauma that they may or may not be experiencing themselves, that they really care enough about other people in our community to want to learn and understand what's happening out there for people. So again, my name is Amy Ebbison. I'm a social worker at Worcester Addresses Childhood Trauma. And of course, our jam is recognizing the connection between early childhood traumatic experiences and later in life outcomes. So of course, food security is one of the kind of most important things for people feeling safe and secure and having agency in the world. And we know that the pandemic has put that in jeopardy for a lot of people. I am delighted to welcome some stars of the Worcester Together movement. Casey and Gina have both, Casey's been leading the logistics, which has got to be a behemoth, right? And Gina's been doing everything. I found lots and lots of news articles and news stories and videos and all of that about the work that you're doing. Again, thank you all for being here. We're super glad you're here. I am going to be monitoring the chat. If you have questions or comments, if the group stays small, you might just be able to jump on in, but we'll kind of play that by ear and hope some more people log in. But I am going to now turn it over to Gina Plata-Nino, who's an attorney from Legal Aid, right? I hope I got all that right. And yes. She's been doing some amazing policy and advocacy work in Worcester. Worcester girl. And Casey Burns, the Coalition for a Healthy Greater Worcester. Casey, you've been doing this for years now, right? Like all of it. The holder of the chip, the community health improvement is in your hands. These two amazing women. Yes, but you're the main holder of it, and we're very grateful. So yeah, I'm going to just turn it over to you guys to kind of talk about what it's like for people experiencing food insecurity, what resources they may have available. And I know that some of the folks on here do have access to resources or know about resources. So we'll either give them a few minutes, they can put things in the chat. If you are just coming on and you would like to introduce yourself in the chat, that's really great for us to have a record of kind of who's been here and who we've talked to. And okay, I'm going to zip it now and turn it on over to you guys.
Amy, thank you so much for this kind invitation. We do have a PowerPoint, but we hope that folks don't think that this is just going to be a presentation. Casey and I really hope that this will be an ongoing conversation. We understand that there are a lot of experts in this room and a lot of resources, and we just hope to be able to engage. Like Amy said, the pandemic has really changed the way the narrative goes. I appreciate what you said, that this has given us a platform to be able to elevate the voices of lived experience and the voices that sometimes get hidden by other sort of policy issues. So we're really excited that we are able to share and talk about sort of the way that this pandemic has lifted the veil on food insecurity. Like I said, we have a PowerPoint sort of slide put together, and you'll get to know us a little bit more and understand a little bit of who we are and why we're doing this and why we're so passionate about
this. Just excited to be here, everyone. And yeah, we're here to discuss. Casey Burns, as Amy introduced, and I'm advancing the slide, and we'll also, we'll be building this presentation together with all of you. So looking forward to the discussion with you all.
And, before we start anything, because we are talking about trauma, we are talking about racism, we are talking about so many issues, it's important for us to acknowledge what sort of land we're on. And so we would like to acknowledge that this training is being held on the traditional lands of the Nipmuc people. The word Nipmuc comes from an Algonquin Indian word, Nipinet, which roughly translates to the freshwater pond place. We pay respect to the Nipmuc Nation and the elders, both past and present. We acknowledge the truth of many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement, as well as generations of survival and resiliency that brings us together here today. And it's important to start with this and acknowledge it, because as we look at some of the statistics that we're going to be talking about, we're going to see how our Indigenous communities have been affected at higher rates and have some of the highest rates of poverty and food insecurity, and it all stems from this particular point of view.
And so just before we get started, we just wanted to talk through a little framework and kind of rules of this space. Just recognizing that we're all learning and growing together, and recognize and respect that we are in different places in our journey. And it's okay to ask questions and say when you need help. And so we have the chat option, you have the raise your hand feature, we can, let's engage and ask questions, being cognizant of sharing the air, knowing that, there's 30 people on this call, how much space are we each taking up in this, and also taking care of yourself when you need to, when you can feel if you're being stressed or overwhelmed or triggered by something, taking the space, turning your camera off, get a glass of water, take a break, pet your cat, whatever you need to do to take care of yourself at the time. Acknowledging that discussing race and racism is hard, and that's okay. We are here to do hard work, and grateful for all of each other to engage in this space. We're hoping to give each other room to learn, and we as facilitators as well are also always willing to receive feedback about how we discuss these issues. It's an honor to be able to do this, and we want to keep honing, and we're constantly kind of learning and growing in how this is presented and shared. And so we want to, as first, just introduce who we are. So you have some of our kind of professional affiliations is Worcester Together, and with the Worcester Food Policy Council. I was with the Regional Environmental Council for 12 years, and now with the Coalition for Healthy Greater Worcester. But I am also a white cisgendered woman. I've lived in Worcester for 20 years. I'm a practitioner of food security and public health policy and programming, but I'm not speaking in many cases from personal lived experience of experiencing food insecurity, as well as being a person of color facing racism, which, as we're going to discuss, really exacerbates these experiences and the trauma of food insecurity. And so I want to clearly acknowledge and state that I'm not an expert in all of this, and I'm sharing my experiences and learning, and will continue to kind of grow and learn in my practice as well.
Thank you, Casey. And this is really our disclaimer, right? While we may not be experts in everything, we are passionate about this community. We truly care. For those of you who are in our food groups and our shelter groups and who have been with us alongside since this pandemic started, and even before that, this is a continuation of conversations. And we're really glad we're able to have this. Like Amy said, my name is Gina Plata-Nino. I'm a Latina, I am an immigrant, I'm a cisgender woman. I left the rest of it open because many of you have asked me, like, where did the passion around food insecurity came? I think it's important to just kind of share a little bit of my story so you understand where I come from, and I'll only take 30 seconds. After I graduated law school, I clerked at the appeals court, and then I had a job offer, but it wouldn't start for a year. I took that opportunity to work overseas as a legal consultant in Southeast Asia. I did corporate work, and I really enjoyed it. At nights and on the weekends, I volunteer with it's sort of like a home for like young people who have been displaced, who have come to the city to get an education. As part of that, I decided to help, along with many foreigners. There was a hub of foreigners, to help and help them clean up their space. I tackle the kitchen. I'm an organizer. Those of you who know me know I like things a certain way. So I'm an organizer. And as I seen these young boys who had left their families behind so that they could come to the city and get an education, I saw that a bag of rice had like worms and bugs in it. And the Western part of me, the American in me, saw that, scream, and said, we need to throw this out. We need to buy these boys more food. This is unacceptable. I can't believe this is here. One of the young boys took me aside and said, no, sister, please don't do that. This is our food. And he spent about 5 hours washing 20 pounds of rice, one by one, getting rid of the worms. And that hit me so deeply. After I finished there, I went home. I called my husband who was overseas, and I cried. And I said, I can't believe it. I throw food out when it just doesn't, it's not appetizing. And we see these young people, and they're cleaning the worms out of food so that they can eat. And so that made me take a look at my life, made me look at the world around me, and what I was doing in this region and how I could get back. So that was my journey into understanding sort of food insecurity and poverty. Take that, I partnered up with a doctor. We started a nonprofit overseas to help these young people with health education and farming. Came back to the States and looked into leaving private practice and really focusing on this issue in the US at a state level. I had the great opportunity that during that time, the Worcester County Food Bank was really innovative and really wanted to talk about a food security project. When I read the job description, I said, wow, this is my newfound passion. How can I be part of this? And I did my undergrad and my grad studies in history. So the historian in me really wanted to understand sort of the policies and practices that brought food insecurity, not just to the state of Massachusetts, not just to the city of Worcester and central Massachusetts, where my focus and practice area was, but to the US in general. And this is where I come from. This is why many of you may see me in sort of different spaces and like wonder, like, why is she in these spaces and what does it have to do with food insecurity? And my goal is that at the end of this training, you will understand why I'm in so different spaces, because understanding sort of the structural racism and the systemic racism from, unfortunately, the founding of our nation gets us to where we are today, and it gets us to this conversation. But I am optimistic that the fact that we can talk about this can lead us to some practical steps. Next slide, please. So we hope, like we said, we're going to give you sort of an overview, a context, and why we're talking about, you might be thinking, well, I thought we were going to talk about food programs. It is, but we hope that we get to the root causes of what causes hunger and how we as a community, I've been so proud to be part of this community, to see how we can make change, because we can, and how we work towards that change and some concrete action steps. And I don't need to tell you this. All of you are experts on this, as you know. But this is the issue, right? We know that unfortunately, people of color in the U.S. are more likely to experience hunger and poverty because of structural racism. And when we think of hunger, for the purposes of this conversation, I just don't want you to think of, oh, I don't have enough food, but I also don't have enough access to nutritional food, because it's something we need to talk about, because nutrition is very important. And I know Kwame is here with WIC and so on. So especially early nutrition and the way that affects our lifespans, right? Because the damage that's caused by nutritional deficiencies and inadequate diets exacerbates the impact of hunger. And unfortunately, the lack of nutrient-rich diet disrupts children's development and leads to chronic illnesses in adulthood, including cardiovascular disease, high blood pressure, and diabetes. Casey's going to talk a little bit more about how that impacts Worcester, but as Casey and I have been doing a lot of vaccine equity work. And when the vaccine first came in stages, we noticed that when it first came 75 and over, we couldn't get Latinos and Blacks to be able to participate, right? Because unfortunately, when you think about these sort of health disparities, our lifespan is not that long. When you think about it from a race equity sort of view, it really does impact, right? So it's so important. Nutrition is so important when we think about sort of the long-term sort of lifespan. Next slide, please. And so these pre-existing inequalities have been amplified by the pandemic, right? This is something that we talked about, is something that many of you here who have been working on food insecurity issues and poverty issues in our city know this, but it really set the stage for other folks to come in, right? For the private sector, for more of the public officials to understand how they can take a role in sort of the work that we're trying to do. But it's important for us as we're trying to move forward, as we're talking about the chip, the chana, as we're thinking about like, how do we move past this pandemic? And people are already doing it, especially those with more privileged backgrounds. They're already doing it. We're going back to work, we're going back on vacations, we're eating out. Pandemic was a terrible thing that happened. But for our most vulnerable, our low income individuals, our people of color, the pandemic has exacerbated their need, and they will be left behind if we don't do something about it. If we don't talk about sort of the policies and how do we change this, right? And we can do this by understanding the impacts of racism and policy development so that we can develop advocacy and program initiatives to address the root causes. Next slide, please. And in general, the barriers to nutrition and food security have always been racially biased public policies, structures, institutions, practices, cultural beliefs, and attitudes. And we're gonna go and talk a little bit and delve a little bit more as we go around, but we're just setting up a framework. And I just wanna show you a graph around structural racism. If you look at structural racism, I hope you can see the slide. You think about, what does this have to do with hunger? Well, it's pretty simple, right? When you have, as we see here, right, we have housing insecurity. What happens? Over 80% of a person's salary goes to rent. Massachusetts is one of the most expensive states to live in, right? So sort of think about that sort of narrative. When we think about the racial wealth divide, who was giving more, who was giving loans, who was giving more sort of opportunities. When you look at employment discrimination, take women, right? Women have been some of the ones who have been affected the most through this pandemic, especially single parent households, right? You don't have childcare, you can no longer work, especially if you're a person of color, right? Over-policing is something that we keep seeing, right? When there's over-policing, it affects the way that people can sort of be able to feel safe and be able to sort of develop themselves. And discrimination in healthcare. We've seen it with the vaccine. A lot of people are scared. And why are they scared? Because unfortunately, people of color have been made as guinea pigs. Sometimes they're not treated the same way as they were at countertops. So when you take all of this, right, when 80% of my salary is going to housing, when the rest of it, Massachusetts is the second most expensive state in the country for childcare. If I'm a single parent, how much money is left over for me to be able to buy food? Much less nutritious food. It's really, really expensive. So take all of that out, and that's how we get to the structural racism part. All of these policies have been set against them and more against people. And this also affects sort of the health disparities and the health inequities that we talk about here today. And Casey's going to tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, thanks, Gina. And so just to kind of back up a little bit and talking about kind of the systems and framework that we're using, I'm going to just share a couple of images that kind of have been helpful for me in making the connections between, kind of these more upstream big system issues and disparities in health outcomes and experiences that individuals have. And so if you've ever been to a presentation by me, I've likely seen this image, and it's a popular image using a kind of like current public health equity work. This is from the Bay Area Regional Health Inequities Initiative, and shows the relationship between upstream kind of structural issues and downstream individual outcomes and experiences. So if you start with the most downstream here, you see mortality. This is who lives and dies. What's your life expectancy? What's rates of infant mortality? What's rates of mortality according to any incident. We can see, and have been taught to see the connection between rates of mortality and disease and injury. We know that, having incidents of cancers, of injuries, of, violent incidents directly relate to mortality. We know, if you have higher rates of terminal illnesses, it could relate to greater rates of mortality. And just like that connection, we've also been taught that risk behaviors that individuals engage in, whether that be smoking, alcohol and drugs, certain sexual behaviors, poor nutrition, lead to incidents of disease and injury, and those lead to rates of mortality. What is not always taught to us is that what happens when you go even more upstream from that, and how do living conditions, or what's also called the social determinants of health. So what does your neighborhood look like? What kind of healthcare institutions are in your neighborhood? What kind of transportation systems are accessible to you? What are the jobs? What are the education? That those things are just as closely related and linked as risk behaviors are to injury or to mortality, as living conditions determine individual risk behaviors in the same kind of relational way. However, when we start to go from beyond risk behaviors to living conditions is when we start to get into more structural conditions and less focused on individual behaviors and outcomes. But if you link those living conditions to even go more upstream, you see links to institutional inequities. So what are the policies from government, from schools, from nonprofit organizations, from funders? Those policies and institutional strategies determine what the living conditions are like and how those equate to inequities. Going up more upstream even than that, the most upstream shown here are social inequities. And this is where we see that value systems about, racism and sexism and, sexual orientation, immigration status, all of these things are determined in people who are leaders in these institutions who create the policies, who create the living conditions, the risk behaviors, the disease and injury, and the mortality. And so this is how we make the connections when we are going to be talking about inequities in food security and how those relate to structural inequities in racism. This was a really helpful tool that, I was introduced to a couple of years ago that helped me really see that upstream, downstream approach and how if we address root causes, or sometimes it's even depicted in a tree image where it's like these social values are the roots of things, and those then reflect in what we see disparities in health outcomes. And when we talk about racism, another kind of framework that I think is important to make clear is that just as when you go in that previous slide from individual behaviors to more structural, racism is also seen with these same, a similar type, of distinction between individual interpersonal racism, internalized racism, and racist beliefs within yourself, how you may, and this may help to determine, what you think you're deserving of, what you think you may want to achieve and that you should be able to access, and how we can advocate to interpersonal racism. And that may be the experiences, and this is often the most thing that people talk about is racist incidents that happen between people, a person in power that is biased according to race and may give preference to resources or access or anything else according to race. But then when you move upward, we start to talk about what are institutional practices of racism. So how do those institutional policies relate to institutional racism of how resources are distributed. And this relates even further to systemic racism. What is embedded in our culture? What is embedded in how, the multiple institutions that are intersecting and all share value systems that are creating multiple pathways of institutional racism, which then may relate to experiences of interpersonal racism and internal racism. So this is kind of just in that other image is an important way to start thinking about structurally what are the impacts here, and this is really what we're talking about. And so racism and the systemic racism exists in all communities in America, including here in Worcester. And there are indicators that there's systemic racism here in Worcester. This is a slide that we are referencing here from a recent presentation, or fairly recent, it was in the second half of 2020, presentation that Dr. Carcil gave to our Health and Human Services Commissioner to City Council on racism as a public health crisis, and really linking that this isn't something we're just seeing in other communities, this is something we see here. And this is examples of data from Worcester showing indication of systemic racism, including Latinos in Worcester have a poverty rate 2 times greater than their white counterparts. In 2017, Black and Latino youth were arrested at rates 3.2 times and 2.4 times higher than white youth. 66% of homeless youth in Worcester identify as Latino, Black, or multiracial. Latino Worcester residents are 3.6 times less likely than white residents to obtain a bachelor's degree. In Worcester, the infant mortality rate for Latino and Black women is 3 times and 2 times greater than their white counterparts. BIPOC community members make up 43% of Worcester's total population, but only 16% of the city of Worcester's full-time employment in 2019. Black and Latino Worcester public school students experience discipline 2 times the rate of white students. Black and Latino community members make up 30% of Worcester's total population, but 53% of DCF children under 18. Black and Latino individuals make up 6% of UMass Medical School's executive and managerial leadership and 13% of total faculty. This is not to say that institutions referenced here that have to, intersect with these indicators are not taking brave and important initiatives to address some of these things. There's, an incredible pipeline program, for example, that UMass Medical School leads with some of the area high schools. But still, this is representing, these are bigger structural issues that are happening where we are still seeing the impacts of racism throughout these systems. This is another image that puts in giving the framework that I always think is important to talk about when we talk about, well, this isn't an image I always use. This is an image I found recently in trying to prepare for this presentation. But one of the points that I often try to make when giving food insecurity discussions is that food insecurity is a complicated and intersecting a set of barriers and conditions that exist. And sometimes, in developing food programming or trying to be supportive of an individual, being food secure, there can be, well, why don't we just open a healthy grocery store? Why don't we just, give free food every week? Why don't we just teach a cooking class? And then people will know how to cook on, this budget of what is allocated within SNAP allowance. These might be all very successful programs, but there may be other factors that are contributing to somebody's overall experience of food insecurity that are still preventing, an achievement of health. So there might be physical and environmental settings that impact food access, availability, barriers, and opportunity. And there's a distinction here, I think, to be made between access and availability. So there might be food available, but not everyone has access to it in the same ways. And that could be food, conditions at home. It could be, do you have a kitchen? It could be what work sites. Well, what's your lunch break like? What kind of food is offered there? What are the, allowances for bringing food and being able to access food in childcare, in neighborhoods? What grocery stores are near you? What's your transportation structure like? All of these things. There is also kind of macroeconomic framework issues that are at play. So what's the policies of the food and beverage industry to impact what food is available? What's the marketing and media saying? What's the food and agricultural determining supply? What are our healthcare systems connections to food resources? All of these things, effects of public policy on, the physical environment settings. These are all connected. Individual factors may be, what is your individual lifestyle? What are your thoughts and beliefs? What is your, biological preference? Do you like cilantro or not? What are your, demographics and individual family makeup that might set, cultural preferences and settings and taste. And then what are your social and environmental networks? So who is around you? What does that model look like? What is your experience with food resources, with accessing food? What's the place of that? So these are all interconnected. And so, but racism, the experience of racism and the experience of developing policy and those institutional inequities impact all 4 of the quadrants in this. But it's important for us to keep kind of this holistic picture in mind of what may make up a particular experience. And I'm going to turn it back over to Gina.
Thank you, Casey. And now we get to the meat, right? We understand like why looking at this with a different frame is important and how everything's interconnected, right? Like we can't just say we're going to tackle hunger. Before we tackle hunger, we need to look at all of these external forces. And if we tackle all of those external forces, then ideally hunger wouldn't be an issue, right? And that's the goal. I think that's the goal for everyone here as well. So how do we do this? Public policies. A lot of the times I engage in conversations with people, with my clients, with people in the community, say like, the way these policies are, they're so unfair, and they are. But how can we as a community work on that, right? So there is such a way. We have such a momentous time right now with Congress. There is, we have 2 years, 2 years to really push our elected officials to push so many positive ways that they can work with us. And we're going to go more into detail about what sort of it's on the pipeline of sort of federal, state, and local policies that we can work on. But I want you to understand why these policies have such a big impact, right? And the way we can do this is that if the people in power, the people at the table, if they think about the way of designing policies in a way that can overcome these disproportionate impacts and reduce the structural racism, right? And we can do this by applying a racial equity lens. If we do this with this lens, which was the needs and leadership of people of color at the center, if we apply it this way to policies and programs, the outcomes should be that progress is made toward eliminating racial inequities. And this is really important that we put people of color at the center, right? I was recently at a meeting with hunger advocates from across the state, and we were talking about how to eliminate hunger. We talk about really important things, but no one talked about the people who were affected the most, right? Which were people of color, Latinx and African Americans and Black individuals. We're talking about eliminating hunger, but we're not talking about the ones who are impacted the most, right? So constantly bringing that sort of BIPOC eye lens and racial equity lens, it's important to bring it. Next slide. And if we do this, then we have a better chance of ending hunger, right? If we reduce vulnerability to hunger, to include that everyone, right? It's not just ensuring that people have access to food. It means addressing the underlying conditions, as we've been discussing, right? That leads to hunger, right? So this is why looking beyond food security measures to the root causes of hunger is so important. Reducing vulnerability means that ensuring that individuals and households have the income and assets necessary to survive, to thrive, and save for the future. Merely ensuring that everyone is fed without regard to whether the food is nutrient-rich or without ending the cycle of living paycheck to paycheck is not ending hunger. Next slide, please. The curve effect. Many of you are familiar with this, but before this is why we keep talking about equity. This is what equality, right? This is sort of the term everyone talks about. Everyone's on the same level, but we understand that our systemic, root causes of racism and many other issues, we're not all at the same level. Not all of us get started. It really makes a difference what zip code you're born in, what last name you're born in, what skin color you have, what country you're brought in, what immigration status. There are so many things, what sexual orientation, like what gender. There's so many different things that affect sort of how you're going to make it out in life. So if we apply the equality, we really can't get there, right? We need to look at an equity approach, right? Where everyone is giving a bite in a way that meets their needs. And the curve effect, because when we do this, right, when we apply positive sort of public policies, it not only affects the target demographics, but affects everyone. So Stanford Social Innovation raised the concept of equity, right? By using the example of the curb cut sidewalk. You guys are familiar, right? There's a sidewalk and they have a curb cut and you're able to do it, right? The curb cuts replaced the sections of the curb with small ramps. And they were originally designed to help people with mobility challenges, right? Particular people who use wheelchairs, right? So they can access sidewalks and streets more easily. Although they were in place to help a specific group of people achieve equal outcome, the curb cuts benefit everyone who uses sidewalks, right? Think about if you've been a parent and you push that little stroller up, it was a lot easier because you had this curb cut. If you had a grocery truck, right, you put it up through. People moving the apartments using hand truck. I know one of you is on vacation, so rolling in that, the luggage, bringing it in, right? It's a positive policy, but it affects everyone, right? So that is why it's so important when we help when we uplift one population that's been targeted or that hasn't had the resources necessary, it really does create a positive impact for as a whole. Next slide, please. And so we're thinking about trauma and hunger. How do we do this, right? We already talked about how people of color, and notice that I'm not using the term minorities because it's important to call out that it's people of color, particularly the demographics that I mentioned, who are a much greater risk of hunger and poverty than the overall US population, right? Because of structural racism, we talked about that. And in the anti-hunger context, racial equity means that people of color are no more likely to be food insecure than the white countertops, right? And we have significant opportunities, particularly now, to achieve this racial equity and reduce the risk of hunger among people of color. Next slide, please. I'm going to talk a little bit, and you're going to see that I'm veering off. I'm going to talk a little bit about public benefits because we talked about hunger, and we, sometimes when we think about how we're going to talk about hunger, we think about our food banks, our food pantries, where it's such a great power and resource among our community, right? They really, especially the nonprofit sector, has really stepped up during this pandemic. There are public benefits, but because of the practices that we have spoken about, they have such a stigma that many of the people, and you will see the data, that are affected the most with hunger are not utilizing it. And so we're going to talk about some of the safety net programs that are available to people living in Massachusetts. These are usually also available across the country, but I'm only going to focus in Massachusetts because those are the ones that we have available, okay? Next slide, please. We're going to take a little bit, I'm going to take you, the historian in me is going to take you on a little history tour so you understand just really briefly, right? When you think of welfare, any of you who were born during the Reagan era, you have this like negative context. We're going to go a little bit more back, right? When we think about welfare, cash benefits, it started back in the early 1900s and it was supposed to be for single impoverished women. Because ministers were administered locally, each state was able to determine how they were going to allocate this money. Because it was locally, each state made so many rules to exclude women of color, right? One common requirement was that a mother maintain a suitable home, right? Which was frequently used to exclude African-American women due to the negative stereotypes of African-Americans, right? So they found that it was not up to the standards, that they found that it wasn't good enough, then it wasn't. Another thing that they would do is Latinas and Black women were exempted from this help because they needed to be out in the fields working. Because how dare they be lazy and allow like their white countertops to be able to stay at home with their kids. During growing season, they were excluded from this benefit because they needed to be out in the fields and working, right? So sort of think about how one group was allowed to stay at home with their kids and utilize this benefit that was supposed to be allocated on an equity base. But unfortunately, because of the color of the skin, other women were not allowed to be with their kids, but they had to be out in the fields working. Then you move down to the 30s with the New Deal and aid to dependent children. And it was similar language. And it allowed, again, states permission to discriminate. And this kept going. And this is a complete different training. We can keep going on this, but I wanted to sort of give you an idea. Next slide. We move down, again, majority, Congress keeps working and approves like support for widows or retired workers. people who have been affected, but again, particular professions that were not allowed for people of color, right? So people of color weren't able to benefit from the safety net program. So when you think about that structural racism chart that I showed you about the wealth gap, if you think about a family that's 3 generations back that was able to get these welfare benefits, that was able to pay the rent, that was able to have a safety net, where are they now versus people of color, particularly African Americans, who didn't have access to these resources? Do you see the disparity? I hope you do. So do you understand sort of where it is and why we look at where we are now, 2021, and there's such a disparity in what we are viewing. You look at post-World War II, and again, more stringent requirements. There's surprise of the middle of the night rates. A lot of my clients or people say, well, why don't people just go on these safety net benefits? Well, people remember their parents or their grandparents saying, you were in bed and they would like come in the middle of the night to make sure that the person who you were sleeping with was your spouse. And if it wasn't your spouse, then it was, it wasn't a good household and they could take your kids or they could stop your benefits, right? And strict residency requirement, right? And they need to be the employable mother rule. Next slide, please. And then you come, and many of you may remember, you look at the war on poverty in 1964, the 60s were a vibrant area, a lot of things are happening. And you have Lyndon B. Johnson, right? And the Great Society in 1960s. And I don't know how many of you remember this photo, but it was in time, right? But he utilized this photo as it was a warrior family. I think he had, I forget the gentleman's name. He had 8 kids. And this was a picture he presented to Congress of why we needed to tackle poverty, because look at this man and his kids, they really needed help. And while it was good intent, it did not address racially biased social policies inherited from the New Deal, all of those rules that I talked about, right? And it created something called block grants. Block grants is something that we're still dealing with in 2021. And it basically allows the federal government to issue you an X amount of money to each state, and the state determines how is it going to utilize it. Next slide, please. And then unfortunately, things get even worse. I even struggle putting this terrible photo here. You look at 1980s and the terrible narrative about Reagan and the welfare queen, right? Like you have this woman of color who's having kids, right? Because she wants to make money off the government. Let me tell you, those payments are so low. There's no way to make money, right? That this whole thing that you're having kids so that the government will give you more money was utterly ridiculous. And you think that, and then you come with the Clinton and the George W. Bush administration in the 90s, which brought about the Welfare Reform Act of 1996, right? So what it did was basically like women, they will be capped. They will have a child, and any child after that, if it didn't meet certain exemptions, will be capped. Those kids weren't able to have cash benefits. And it wasn't removed until a couple of years ago here in Massachusetts after much advocacy. But this is something that had detrimental effects on many people, particularly women of color. And if you have the time, I highly recommend that you read this great book. It's called Living on $2 a Day. And what it also did, and many of you have heard me a lot talk about public charge, is that it limited the eligibility for immigrants, right? It took away it put a 5-year bar, it put public charge issue, something that we've been talking about instead of the safety net. So this is what it did, each administration, and I mentioned this because these are elected officials, right? We have a say before they are being published, before these recommendations are being mandated. We have a say. So it's really important for us to sort of keep an ear out. And you don't have to be a knowledgeable all. I encourage you to sign up to our Food Policy Council or our SNAP Central Mass Coalition, or to our Worcester Together food group that meets every Tuesday at 9. And we talk sort of about these policies and what we can do in terms of advocacy. Next slide. And I think this is really important in terms of what we think. And I wanted to show this. I talked about welfare. TANF is like the name. But it's been shown, and I got this data for the Center of Budget and Policy, but in states that are more, the percentage of the demographics are white, they get more cash benefits than in states that have more of a population and demographics who are people of color, right? So take, for example, in 2017, 2018, for every 100 families living in poverty in Massachusetts, only 34 receive TANF, right? And this TANF poverty to ratio has fallen 46 points since 1996, right? 1995. So that means that in 96, look how high it is. But through this like poverty ratio has going on, right? If TANF reached the same share of families in poverty that its predecessor did in 1996, it will help 39,800 more families in Massachusetts. And keep this in mind that this data hasn't been updated since the pandemic. And I'm sure a lot of people have gone below the threshold of poverty level. So it will probably affect a lot more people. Next slide, please. And this is what I was trying to say, right? So in 2017-18, for every 100 families living in poverty in Vermont, only 50% received TANF. Do you notice the difference if you look at demographics of Vermont and Massachusetts? How people in Vermont got more help because of the demographics? Where I look at Louisiana, that for every 100 families living in poverty in Louisiana, only 4 received TANF, right? Look at the demographics, right? The data, well, data sometimes, you know, it's not as biased as most of the things. But I want you to understand that because it does play a role on who the demographics are and who makes the decisions are our elected officials. So it's very important to hold them accountable and to have this data to let them know why it is important to have a racial equity lens. Next slide, please. So who's getting welfare? I'm going, and you might be thinking this is about hunger, right? But SNAP doesn't pay, and you know, and our food pantries don't pay for gas. They don't pay for electricity. They don't pay for rent. This is where welfare comes in, right? With the childcare and car insurance, this is where welfare pays, right? So this is important why we're talking about this. And I wanted to show you, these is cash assistance data from characteristic and financial circumstances of recipients of the census data of 2018. It takes 2 years to be updated, but I wanted to show you again, you look at the US population, we have white at 64%, we have Black at 13 and Hispanic, Latinos at 15, right? You look at the mass population, right? 81% are white who gets welfare. 9% are Black and 12% are Hispanic. Do we see that? Do we look at the difference? Next slide, please. And when we look at the SNAP, right, because this is food insecurity, we look at how people who have access to these benefits are able to get out of the poverty line. Currently, 92% of households with incomes are at or below the poverty level are 92%. But once they have SNAP, many of them are able to overcome the poverty level. So it's important to have access to these programs. Next slide, please. And we talk about, so this is again from the Sector and Budget and Policy. We look at whites without a college degree are the largest group of working age adults who are lifted above the poverty level by the safety net. This data is a little bit, it's not as updated as we would like. The Center for Budget Policy hasn't updated it lately. It has changed, but you could still see, again, based on a particular way that you were born, the color of your skin, you are more likely to be lifted out of poverty just for the simple way of being born a different color, which is part of why we need to talk about a racial equity lens. Let's look at a couple of more slides, and then we'll open it up for conversation. When we look at poverty nationwide, and we talk about, next slide, about who lives in poverty, you look at the data. Look at the slide, for example. Nationwide, whites are at 9%. Multiple races are at 50%. American Indian, Alaska Natives at 24%. Asians, Native Hawaiians, Pacific Islanders are a smaller percent. Latinos are at 90%, and Blacks are at 22%. This is nationwide. Let's look at Massachusetts, where we are in Massachusetts in terms of poverty. Whites are at 7%, Blacks at 17%, Latinx 23%, Asian, Native, Hawaiian, Pacific Islanders at 11%. Multiple races are 11%. And please, again, keep in mind that this is from the Kaiser Foundation, and this hasn't been updated as of the data of last year. And I'm pretty sure that this data has completely and dramatically changed, unfortunately, for the worse, because we know that Latinos and Blacks were affected by this pandemic at 4 times to 6 times the rates than their white counterparts. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And this is some data that Project Bread did in collaboration with another organization, just sort of showing the trend of food insecurity by race and ethnicity in Massachusetts. And again, we have our Latinx community, one of the highest experiencing food insecurity. Next slide, please. I wanted to show this SNAP demographics in terms of immigration status, because again, the narrative is not who is really utilizing SNAP, right? You have that US born citizens utilize SNAP at 91.4% of the rate. Naturalized, 4.3%. Refugee, 0.9%, and other non-citizens, 3.4%. We see that our immigrant community has been targeted and feels so afraid. We're grateful for the administration who, stopped the public charge rules brought by the previous administration, and that's a step in the right direction. The better step would be, and here's an action step of policy, right? How do we take away the 1996 administration, the Clinton administration rules that brought about these particular public charge rules to begin with? Next slide, please. And we talked about, again, Massachusetts SNAP demographics. Who is on SNAP, right? White, 57%. African Americans, we have 15%. Latinos, 22%, or Latinx, 22%, and Asians, 6%. So take that, and I don't have screen capabilities, and think about the poverty rates, right? Do you remember whites were 9%, Latinos and Latinx and Blacks were what? Over 15 to 20% of poverty rate. But look who has been getting access to these services. Next slide, please. And this is why when we think about hunger, we have to think about what sort of programs and how do we utilize these programs to help people, right? And SNAP is one of these programs, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, right? It's one of the best programs to help people with hunger, right? It provides benefits to enable people below 200% of the federal poverty level to buy groceries they need. It's equitable because it's an entitlement program, which means that anyone's entitled to apply. Whether or not you'll be found eligible is a different story, right? And benefits increase with family size. And it utilizes EBT cards and benefits, which allow people to access it in various places. You've heard a lot from me for a little bit. I'm going to turn it over to Casey for a little bit when we think about sort of like this welfare and the SNAP sort of history roundabout journey that I took you on some sort of policy recommendations that we think will be able to sort of change this narrative and impact communities of color in a positive way as we're thinking about hunger and eliminating the trauma that this hunger causes. I'll turn it over to you now, Casey.
Oh, thanks, Gina. And we do, so we have just a few more slides and we have some recommendations at the end and want to leave lots of time for discussion. So saw that there's, some good activity in the chat and people are interested in asking questions and engaging. So just to let you know, we promise we won't talk for another full hour and we'll be able to leave time for discussion, but just want to kind of frame out some of these policy recommendations and suggestions for making impact on these tremendous barriers that we're seeing. And so these are policy recommendations, generalized speaking, of where we can promote equity in access to resources and benefits. Recommendation 1, increase the monthly benefit amount. 2, increasing access to and consumption of healthier food options. Eliminating practices that exclude or hurt people of color, support SNAP-related measures that promote equity, strengthen hiring, training, and accountability of caseworkers, and establish a mechanism for SNAP beneficiaries to equitably participate in program design, planning, and evaluation, strengthen the collection and disaggregation of data within SNAP. So this speaks to, kind of all of these different areas as we set up earlier in this kind of historical representation of how we've gotten to this inequitable system that we're at now. What are the structures playing into it? How does this feed in? And so, but if we can make these recommendations across options, we think that we can make impact in where we're seeing disparities. And so we can do some recommendations. Gina and I kind of just share a few of these as well. Go ahead, Gina.
So I just wanted to say that a good policy, as we've seen increasing the monthly benefit, I don't know if you know this, but during the pandemic, people who are on SNAP have been able to get the maximum amount, right? That is an example of a positive policy. right? So a household, usually the minimum SNAP allotment is $16. And right now is $204. So most people will probably be at $16, $70, but because of the pandemic, people were across the board putting at a maximum. So this is an example of a positive policy. Another example of a positive policy that helps, and not only does it help the individual and the household, but it also supports the local economy, because for every dollar spent of SNAP, $1.70 goes into the local economy, right? Another positive thing, I know Amy started with PEBT, pandemic EBT, right? Kiddos had to stay home because of the pandemic. So what happened? Congress made a positive policy which allowed kids who would have been eligible for free or reduced meals to get that money in a card for their parents to be able to purchase meals, right? So this is another example of positive policies. Now, I want to bring this up so you don't think that like Congress has been doing these terrible things. They haven't. I was just taking you through a history, but also to a history now of like really good positive pieces that our Congress has done and our state has done. And there's more pieces that we're gonna talk in a little bit. And so how Casey put to this, like, how do we work towards that solution? When we think about sort of these policy solutions, right? This is very important. We need to center the needs and leadership of communities of colors first, right? We need to ask about impact. We need to be included as full partners in the policy, design, implementation, and evaluation. It's important. If you look at an ag committee of Congress, if you ever watch C-SPAN, if you look at the hearings, it's a lot of white men. It's old men. And it's just, and a very privileged, right? They don't bring people there with lived experience. So how are we going to bring this? How are they going to understand what, a single mother, a Black single mother deals with, right? So it's important for us, if we have place at the table, if we get invited to these meetings, that we bring up these issues and bring in experts, right? Experts with lived experience. We also need to name and consider each community of color individually, avoiding terms such as minority, right? Because each community of color is very, very different. And Worcester's like the perfect example, right? Like we just have, it's so incredibly diverse. And that's one of the things that I love about the city, right? So we need to name African Americans as African Americans, indigenous populations, right? Latinos, Latinx, Native, Hawaiians. We need to name each and every one, right? Because each one is diverse within this racial categorization, and identify how the particular policy or program proposal will impact members of each community. Go ahead, Casey. Next slide.
Yeah, and this next one's really about how do we analyze the specific outcomes for each racial and ethnic group. So how does each racial and ethnic group fare with each outcome that is being measured? What are the reasons for that outcomes experienced by each racial ethnic group? What is the disaggregated racial and ethnic makeup of the population that this program serves or seeks to serve? And what is or expected to be the impact of this program or policy on each participating racial and ethnic population? And we work a lot with public health data, with the Community Health Improvement Plan. I can say, Lori will attest to this, how hard it is to access disaggregated data, because that's not how many data sets are set up, are visualized, are presented, are shared and used. But without that specific information that we were talking about here, we cannot be held accountable or know or reference or pivot in order to achieve impacts that we are seeking to achieve. And so really that use of very specific data and specific outcomes is going to make a difference and has a potential to make a great difference in the way that we shape and frame our work.
And going off, right, how do we set up policies and programs that are responsive in a way that proportionate to the disparate impacts, right? Most policies and programs treat all communities the same. Do you remember that slide where everyone is giving the same bike? I know some of them have given using the other photo where everyone's standing on the same box, right? Regardless of the different starting points or barriers faced by the specific racial and ethnic communities, right? And we talked about sort of a history. If a particular community has been targeted and has not been allowed to have access to these programs, how are we saying that we're treating them all of the same? And we're seeing it more now when we look at many federal programs. Language access, it's such a big problem. Look at through this pandemic, internet access. If you didn't have a laptop, if you didn't speak English, if you didn't have internet, you were left behind by this pandemic. So you weren't able to access these benefits. So it's important to sort of keep uplifting, right? Instead of saying like, oh, this is so great, people can do it. Yes, people can do it because you yourself, and I put myself in that bubble. I've been working from home since the pandemic. We've had plenty of internet. To me, it was like, great. I don't have to, pay for parking and going to work. I can just work from home. Well, many people didn't get to do that, right? So why would I base the way I'm going to administer a program based on my experience when it's not something that I'm dealing with, right? So responses need to be community and circumstance specific. The support should be proportionate to the disparate impact and deeply rooted in the specific community's history of discrimination. Disaggregating data, like Casey said, data is so important. Asking a lot of these programs is, how are you counting the data? Because data is what allows us to be able to tell a story and advocate. So disaggregating data of each community of color will help determine how much targeted support each community of color needs and how it should be provided.
Yeah, and then of course, including a robust implementation monitoring plan. How are we accountable to the programs that we decide that they're having the impacts they're going to? How do we ensure targeted support is provided, thoughtful, racial equitable way, programs and policy must sufficiently be resourced for effective implementation, enforcement of policies and program rules, entities of color that directly serve their communities and other experts of color with lived or scholarly experience should be assigned to co-lead the implementation process. In evaluation and monitoring, Raquel Castro-Corazzini from Division of Youth Opportunities, I think really articulated well recently, programs that are, signing these statements, after George Floyd's murder, saying, Black Lives Matter, or they're signing on to this, how can they look back at their programs that they implemented and articulate, how did you show that Black Lives Matter to you? How did you prove that you were able to follow through and make an impact on that? Were you able to resource your programs and shift priorities in ways that you are able to do that? How can we be accountable to the statements that we are putting out and the programs that we are designing to have the intended effects?
Thank you, Casey, for that. And I appreciate how you said that, because I know Etel from CMHA spoke at the last trauma, and she talked a lot about housing insecurity. And there's so many positive bills going right now in front of our state legislature. And again, we talk about, yes, Black Lives Matter. Now we're talking about Asian Lives Matters and all of these groups. How do we say that they truly matter? Is by putting our vote and our advocacy into action. And I want to share with you two quick sort of action steps that you can take. I don't know if you know this, but for college students who are in SNAP, they have to face additional hurdles. And this has a lot of history of what college students have to do with this. And a lot of it has to do with the Vietnam War era and, who had access to college. So, college students face additional hurdles to access SNAP. But right now, Representative Gomez from California has reintroduced, and reintroduced means, again, he tried in the past. I'm not surprised with the previous administration, but he's trying again, and this will take away a lot of the regulations around SNAP. And I don't know if you know this, but our college students, particularly our community college students, are deeply affected by this, by food insecurity. I've been in those spaces where they're like, yeah, I work a full-time job and go to school. The suggestion is to work no more than 10 hours a week in order for you to be able to successfully graduate. Yet the SNAP program requires 20 hours a week, right? And it's something about privilege, right? When I went to college, I worked because I wanted money to go out to eat with my friends, right? Whereas other people have to go to work during college because you have to pay the rent, you have to help your parents. It's a different sort of privilege. So this helps with this. And then SNAP and the able time limits. This is a terrible, terrible rule that came from the 1996 bill. But basically what it does is that able-bodied adults without dependents. So it's people from 18 to 49 who have no kiddos, right? And it basically says that they are only allowed to get SNAP for 3 months out of a 3-year period. And if they want any sort of additional SNAP during that time, what they're required to do is to volunteer or to work. So you're going to tell someone who's food insecure, There are certain exemptions, right? But you're gonna tell someone who's food insecure that they need to volunteer about 20 hours a week in order to get about, at that time, they've been called it $204 a month of SNAP benefits. How are they getting to this volunteer place? How are they working with this? And particularly in Central Massachusetts, where we have limited nonprofits, we have limited transportation. How do you do this? And so a lot of people don't have access to SNAP. And all of these came, again, from this narrative of who was accessing SNAP, which is not really true. So, if you can, definitely reach out to Representative Congressman McGovern, to Markey, to Senator Markey and Warren, to make sure that they support both of these bills. And if you are in the Sturbridge area, Representative Neal. If you're in North County, Trahan. Let's work with them so that they can put this at the federal level. And Casey's going to talk about sort of like the action steps at the state level, which I'm really excited about, because this is something that's come out of sort of the Worcester Together work that we've been doing. And that really reflects the need of our communities. Casey.
Yeah, so both in the Worcester Food Policy Council and the Worcester Together Food Group, we're really actively supporting two pieces of legislation that have been filed that we are excited about. And as Gina said, things really respond to some of the local needs that we've seen. So the first is an act to protect the safety net. And this is a piece of legislation that would require the DTA to engage in a community engagement process before closing or relocating their offices. For all the things that we talked about and seen, having a physical office location because not everyone has internet access, not everyone has transportation access, having a physical office location people can go into to apply for benefits, to access their benefits, to ask questions, to meet with case managers, to resolve issues is critically important for many community members. During the pandemic, or during the last year, we saw that the DTA office in Worcester relocated away from their downtown location, and the Plymouth office closed. And so the community then had to react and rally to engage in, but really before it was too late to this. And so this would require this engagement and feedback before making that decision. And so we have the specific House and Senate dockets here listed. It's sponsored by Senator Moore, Representative Keefe, and Representative Duffy. We also have an organizational sign-on sheet, which we will then send you specific pieces of advocacy, social media posts to share, letters, templates where you can either thank or ask your representatives in order to sign on as well. We are seeking more co-sponsors for that. And then the second.
Sorry, Casey, but if I may add, so I don't know how many of you remember this, but I know some of you here, I see your faces. You worked with us in this last January, right? Like DTA told us they were going to move, and I didn't have a chance to put here the census data. But if you look at the map where the previous DTA office was, it was where more than 90% of the lowest with the highest poverty rate and communities of color were based. And then they DTA decided to move to the furthest part of the 20 Southwest cutoff, where the demographics are very different, but also the poverty rate, it's so incredibly low. So it will benefit very low the communities, right? So when we think about sort of the policies and if they would have had someone, if they would have checked with the community, if they would have checked with their clients, right? Because by law, they're required to administer these programs in a meaningful way. And they get billions of dollars from the federal government, right, to run these programs. If they would have done the sort of the policy approach that we're talking about from a racial equity lens, if they were spoken to the community and said, hey, client of mine, thanks to you, I have a job, I can pay my mortgage, client of mine, tell me how you struggle coming in here, or tell me, how this will affect you. But they didn't, right? So we have these agencies who are making these decisions without checking in with the people that is administering or providing the service with, right? This usually doesn't happen in the private sector. Why do we allow it with our low-income individuals, primarily with our communities of color, right? So it's important to just kind of get this. And our legislature was incredibly supportive. But like Casey said, by the time we got here, it was too late because they had already signed the lease. So we want to prevent other communities who are not as organized as we are from finding out, like Plymouth, oh, we're just closing. The Milford office closed about 10 years ago. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with Milford is, but those folks got transferred to Framingham and to Worcester. There is no public transportation from Milford to here. I drive there. You know, it's difficult for people who don't have transportation. So again, they're saying, if you don't have a car, then these benefits are not for you. So these are the things that we need to start thinking about. Sorry, Casey, I mean to interrupt you.
No, not at all. But the second piece of legislation that we are rallying around and pushing is an act concerning food insecurity and supporting the restaurant industry. And so this would be a piece of legislation which would essentially require the DTA to seek the federal option, which already exists, to expand SNAP utilization for populations who are 60 or over, have a severe disability, or are unhoused or unstably housed or homeless, to use their SNAP benefits at participating restaurants for nutritious meals. And so we have learned through the pandemic here that there are periods of life, there are circumstances, there are people who have food insecurity and may not be able to have their needs met by going to a grocery store and preparing food. They might not have kitchen access. They may not have the ability to cook it. They may not be able to warm food up. And so we've been, through COVID, we saw that experience very clearly demonstrated, where we had people being asked to quarantine and isolate who were sick because it was an infectious disease. And so they were being asked, don't go to the grocery store, don't go anywhere. So it was like an easy link for many to be able to be made. Well, then let's bring food and resources to them to be able to support them during this period where they're ill, as well as to contain community spread. But this same and so we were able to establish a restaurant meals program and deliver now over 20,000 meals to COVID positive individuals in Worcester. However, this same principle applies, and these same insecurities and barriers exist for many populations on accessing regular nutritious food on a regular basis. And so this pilot program exists in several states, some not as a pilot. California has been running this program for 15 years that has demonstrated success, and best practices have developed. Rhode Island does this with Subway restaurants. We are hoping to be able to get this to pass statewide in Massachusetts, and then ask for Worcester to be able to be shown as a pilot, since we already have this established pathways with restaurants to be able to expand SNAP access. We think this is a really important piece of legislation that expands kind of dignity and choice. It expands nutritious offerings, as well as supports the restaurant industry, which we can see can be very vulnerable with a concentration on small, independently owned restaurants providing culturally responsive meals. And again, we have filed these. We have the Senate and House dockets here. It's sponsored by Senator Kennedy and Representative Donahue. We are looking for more co-sponsorships. You can sign on as an organization, and we can add you to list to get resources on how to advocate further on social media, with the press, and also directly with legislators to ask for their support on this as well.
Thank you, Casey. And we really need your support, because there have been over 6,000 bills filed this session, right? So even getting the bills to committee is important. And, we don't have a lobbying body. Casey and I do this, and, because we're passionate about this. But we really want to make sure that when we think about like long-term sort of positive policy effects, we really believe that these two bills coming from our own community, based on the experiences that we've seen this past year, will have such a positive impact. And so we need your help to reach out to your representative and to tell them to make this a priority, to make this into committee. So we're really hopeful. And the next slides just include the flyers that one of our great team members from the Worcester Together Food Group created for us, and we're happy to send them. I saw the chat that people want the slides. We'll put it as a PDF and try to get it over to folks. And we'll also send over some of these slides. So we've come to the end really of our presentation, and I know we sort of took you on a long journey, and I want to finish it with what have we learned this past year, more on a local base. And Casey's really going to take us about some of And we could spend like hours talking about the amazing work this community has done, particularly the grassroots organizations, and we're so proud of them, and we're so humbled to be part of this great movement. But we're going to focus just on 3 sort of groups, and then after that, we're going to open it for hopefully some sort of conversation and how we as a community move forward with what we have just. Many of you, it's just reinforcement. Some of us might have learned this, but sort of like engage in conversation, because this is what we hope we would do. So I'm going to turn it over to Casey, which would talk about these 3 main examples, and then we'll open it up to folks to really just kind of share some sort of feedback and some sort of action steps or any sort of questions that you may have had about the presentation.
Yeah, we want to lift up, kind of 3 examples of initiatives that we've really had the privilege to be able to work closely with over the pandemic in order to support and hear from. And, there's been so many. We just quickly wrote down 3. But this is just, examples of applying an equity lens. We saw, I think the examples are kind of how we can apply an equity lens and those recommendations to policy development. And here's really like an equity lens to program development, which, as we saw with the Hot Meals program, can lead to policy development, because it's that best practice, that's experience, that's proven practice, that then you say, let's lift this up as a standard of practice through a policy. And so the Southeast Asian Coalition has really led the way with so much leadership in support of their elder community and wider community with food delivery, emotional support, and really a sovereignty model. How do we support within the Southeast Asian community, within, working amongst different, also, diverse communities of color to support and understand what people need through the pandemic and otherwise, that, it wasn't just access to a simple food drop off. It was a check-in, it was a friend, it was, I'm going to meet your needs where you're at and be able to provide the kinds of food, the kinds of healing and support through this time that is needed in order to really lift people up and make them feel comforted and supported. The Hot Meals delivery program we already mentioned, but this was like a real program that led to this larger policy development. We saw the experience that sick community members with COVID were experiencing and the barriers, and this was and also the ability to make connections with small businesses, especially Black and Brown owned businesses, to be able to provide the transportation, to provide the food in really meaningful ways that were enriching, and that led to bigger development. And then I just wanted to, the Regional Environmental Councils has a pipeline initiative responding to how do we elevate leadership opportunities, training, education opportunities for young people to lead into other roles and leadership roles in the fields, decision-making roles. And so enter in as youth as part of their youth programs, but then can lead to kind of staff, board members, and other leadership positions are in food justice around the city. So just wanted to the examples are there from our community. There are many others as well where we've seen an equity-based program development model really have success and impact. And then that leads us to our questions. And just, open it up for any questions people have. We put a couple of examples, just want to hear from you all, kind of how this resonated, how do we apply this work locally, where do we go from here? Do we see other examples of anti-racist policy development locally that we want to kind of rally around and work together on, but also open to any other questions and kind of clarifications in the group as well.
There is a question up here by Sadie. And the question was if we could paint a picture of how public officials, which make decisions on how much a state gets for cash benefits. And I talked about that. So it's block grant. SNAP is not block grant. We just get the money. But block grant is that the governor, the legislature decides how they're going to utilize it. And you can ask for this. We've done a couple of records requests about this, but some of the money goes to financial aid. A lot of it goes to like overhead costs, but it doesn't necessarily mean that when you think of, 90% or 90 cents to the dollar is going to recipients. If you really break down that data, it's actually not that high. And I don't have the numbers before me, so I can't break it down for you. I'm happy to share the sort of the Excel breakdown that we receive sort of as a follow-up. I hope that answers your question, Sadie, but each state is different and each state decides how to utilize that block grant money. That's why block grants are not great. because the state, depending on who's in power, decides how to do it and how they're going to utilize it. And this is why you see sort of the discrepancies and how certain states, like I mentioned, like Vermont, they can say, oh, we're going to give more higher benefits to families. And yet Louisiana, oh, we're going to make it really difficult. We're going to make it lower. That's how, because the states get to decide how that money is going to be utilized. I don't know if other folks have any other questions.
It was so helpful to see. I loved all the kind of pieces you wove in to put the bigger picture together. That has definitely struck me in general and through the pandemic. These systems aren't transparent. It's if you're not trying to figure it out, you can't find the information. And even when you're trying, like I worked in the mental health system, and even like took focused study on trying to figure out how are these decisions made? What happens here? Who's at these tables? And I think that's such a big piece of why we are where we are. And so I just really appreciate you raising that for me. So many of these pieces I didn't see and didn't have. And they're, of course, very closely related to policies, problems, issues in all these other, in the child welfare system, in the housing system. Like the theme running through Trauma Training Tuesdays is real clear. And I think that that's a part of this too. Once you kind of get marginalized or you fall down, it's real hard to advocate for yourself. And they don't make it easy to know even what to advocate for and how to see it. So just the fact that we've done so much advocacy in this community, and it's not an accident that we're where we are, because voices of leaders of color have been prominent through this. And so really grateful to you for this work, and just all of this information I think is really helpful. And I'm glad I got to turn my camera off, because I was pulling all kinds of like mad, like, oh my God. I'm like, I see why Gina is so fired up. This is really impactful, because we know this is impacting people's lives. They're like, their quality of life is very directly impacted by this. So thank you for raising it. And I think many of the people in the audience were right there with me with like, wow. So I will just turn it over to people's questions. And I know we have some other experts. I know Kwame's here and Jean's from the food bank. And I know REC was going to try. And Casey, I know you can speak to REC's benefits quite a bit as well.
And I just wanted to add, while people gather their thoughts, that just think of the curve side effect. When we uplift, we work really hard with DTA, asking them to stop moving their office. One of the things we said, you can't move the office because you can only apply for benefits in person. If you move it there, this is going to affect. They didn't have an option to do it via internet, right? Or you couldn't apply over the phone. Because of the advocacy of this community, they started implementing so they could say to our legislature, oh, no, we have it. Don't worry, we can check this off. Well, guess what happened in March? The pandemic happened, and this agency was way ahead of other state agencies because they already had a format to do it online, right? And I see faces here, I see Jean, I see Diane, I see faces here who struggle, were with us. And our key partners, again, was our legislature. Like you said, who's at the table, who has the power? Our legislature was in the forefront, calling them and saying, this is not okay. So by creating this sort of policy, this like curve side effect policy that really helped this community, right? It didn't solve the problem. It helped the rest of the Commonwealth, right? It helped people regardless of your race, your gender, your religion, your immigrant status. It helped. It's part of the solution. There's still a lot more to do. But this is when we talked about those policy practices and those steps, like what happens when you actually involve the whole community. Not only certain people get a positive benefit, but it positively affects everyone across the board.
That's exactly what we advocate in social and emotional well-being of youth. Imagine that all of them have experienced trauma and act accordingly. And absolutely, we can see everywhere that policies that benefit all of us are the way to go, like always the way to go. Some, but not others, is just more and more disparity. I think that people, is that a question in the chat, Gina, or was it just, if people want to jump in about resources they know of or anything they've seen, just jump right on in.
Thanks, Amy.
Yes,
Sorry.
Sorry, Jane.
No, let's go.
Go ahead, please.
Oh, thanks, Kwame. No, it wasn't a question. It was more just like a comment or an observation that we definitely need to sort of walk multiple paths, both in terms of policy and programs, but then underlying that, it's really about representation, or how do we, elect people representative of different communities who bring that experience, that perspective. And I think we have a lot of work to do on that.
That's great. I was also going to add one of the coolest things that I've seen happening in the city was the Southeast Asian community really, coming up to task with the delivery of meals. And especially now that we are talking about even Stop Asian Violence, I think it's kind of bringing the communities together to realize that we are all in the same boat. And as we put our resources together, we can maybe move policy to better help the community. And especially in terms of work, we've taken different policies from SNAP to make it work for us. For example, with the whole online and the phone appointments. And one of the issues that we are facing now is people are not using their benefits as we would like for them to. And as much as the state has tried doing focus groups or even calling clients to let them know, the numbers still keep rising. So for everybody in the chat, one thing that can really help us is to let families know that pretty much anybody can use your benefits for you. One of the examples that I make is, even if you live in a household where you don't trust people, you can let them use it for you one time and change your password right after they come back from the supermarket. And then also, unfortunately, people have the misconception that if you need a new debit card, you'll have to pay for it, which they do not. So they can lose their card as many times and we will always replace it for them. And especially in the Worcester area, one of the things that we've started doing is reissue the card and leave it outside in the mailbox, which is an open mailbox for people to be able to pick it up. The card is pretty much worthless until you have the password. So we always tell clients that as much as they may feel that it's not secured, anybody can grab it and they still won't be able to access your benefits until they have your password. And especially for pregnant women, also we've seen a decline in the amount of pregnant women who are seeking services. Pretty much for WIC, you can self-declare your pregnancy. I like to make a joke of how I can go in, tell them I identify as a woman and I feel pregnant. And if I qualify based on my residency, based on my income, or even based on my eligibility, they will have to begin services for me. So we've had pregnant women who unfortunately have had miscarriages. And we always encourage them to still come back because no one can really question if you're pregnant or not. And we give you at least, 60 days until the doctors know. And if it's a false pregnancy, it's okay. And if it's a positive pregnancy, then the services will keep continuing. And then also in terms of appointments, we've realized that many families have to go to work. So they are not always able to stay home to be able to do the appointment. So they can assign anybody, a neighbor, grandparents, even extended families who do not live in the state can get on the phone call and do the appointments for them. Because pretty much we cannot issue the benefits until the appointments are done. So that has been harder for families who have 2-3 jobs sometimes and are not able to receive the phone calls during our opening hours. And also in terms of the respect factor, even myself included, I think before the pandemic, we took our clients lightly, as in terms of, thinking we were always doing the best for them. And since the pandemic began, we've really taken into account how people would like to be treated, how they would like to be spoken to. And one example is, I'm from Ghana, West Africa. Not everybody in Ghana speak Tree. There's different languages. There's about 24 different languages. And before the pandemic, I always assumed if I saw a Ghanaian name, just get the interpreter on the phone and just have the interpreter speak Tree. And what I've started realizing is people have they may have like a first grade understanding of Tree, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the information that we are giving them, they are really taking it in. So I think we have a lot to do. And then also one of the things that I've personally started asking clients is anything they don't like about the operating of the WIC services in the Worcester area. Family Health Center on Queen Street is the parent agency. Not necessarily a complaint, but whatever suggestion, complaints, they should direct it to Family Health Center so we can get the program to be better and also to be able to serve families the way they want to be served. Thank you.
I really appreciate that, Kwame, that you are always thinking about the barriers and how to eliminate them, and that approach of whatever it takes, we'll work with you, I think really is exactly what's needed. So much appreciated. Bill, I don't know if you wanted to chime in and talk about the point that you made in the chat around making sure that we have voices of color on boards, on decision-making, anybody who's making, sorry, my dog distracts me. You heard all, it's Hans, I'm gonna mute, Bill, go take it away.
Yeah, sure. No, it's something that I've been, I'll use the word harping on because I just never stopped saying it. Like I really enjoyed Jean's point, but I realize that there's a huge hurdle there. It's great to say that we need to elect people, but an election is a fickle, organism. You know what I'm saying? And so we can try to elect all the people of color that we want, but they won't necessarily get in. So I believe it's like totally up to all of us, especially in the anti-racism sphere, to say that when I go back to my company, when I go back to my board, when I go back to my business, when I go back to wherever it is I go, where I'm participating in some kind of power and authority or governance over something, that I take and get the people around me to take the position that we need to bring on more women, more people of color, more Blacks, more Latinos, more Indigenous folks, from all around. When you walk into a boardroom and it's all older, white, privileged males, that's a problem. And that's where a lot of, unfortunately, our not civic, but our local and elected state, city, and federal, organizations are staffed by. Even here in the city, I mean, we like to say that we are taking or having an effort in doing this, but the number of people who are of color working in the city administration here is pathetic. And so we all need to go back. It doesn't matter if it's your scout troop, if it's your community organization, if it's your whatever, you can go back and say, we need more of X, Y, and Z in this group. And that will then help to have more, people of color that are available to start making decisions and inform other policies and things like that in our areas. So I hope that's what you were looking for, Amy.
Excellent. Yeah, no, that is really, and even the framework that you used where you really showed about who's impacted versus who's making decisions versus that applies to all the sectors in our city, right? And in the holding them to account piece. And I again appreciate that you brought that to the table as well, because it is really easy to say, you care about this, it's a lot harder to actually take action and do something tangible long-term to change it. Cheryl, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm just wondering if there's anything particular in regards to elders and food insecurity. I know just seeing you makes me think of that population. I know you've been really making sure they're taken care of, and food insecurity is a concern there.
Yeah, I do. I meet with the senior update group every other Friday, and they're continuing to deliver meals to the foods I know on, and SEAC is doing a lot. They're even, helping elders get to their COVID vaccination appointments if they don't have transportation. But, Worcester Housing has a food pantry, and St. Paul's Elder Outreach is continuing to deliver food to elders in the community along with SEAC. And the senior center on Thursdays and Fridays, they have grab and go. So you can just drive up to the senior center. The seniors can drive up and pick up meals. But yeah, they're continuing with their outreach to the seniors. They're checking in with them. I know the senior center has made over 30,000 calls since this all started. I know that number has grown. That was the last number that Amy gave me, but they're continuing to reach out and check in on them, make sure, they're taking care of their needs and their mental health also. So.
Thank you.
If I may, Amy, to just kind of jump off what Cheryl said, when we think about our elders, again, I know many of my clients, they have flip phones. Technology is something. I think about my abuelita, they have, even if they have the fancy phones, they're like, they don't even and I don't want to overgeneralize, but it just, again, in-person interaction is so important. And this technology boost has left people behind. So as we're thinking about positive policies, as offices begin opening up, let us not forget those who, have flip phones and who don't want to have to interact with this via. People really miss in-person interaction. And I go up into language access or any sort of disability that makes it difficult for people to have access. This is why having, local DTA offices where it's accessible to people, it's so important. And I just want to highlight, I know there's a lot of SNAP outreach providers here, to keep eye out for our elderly, to make sure that they're not getting disconnected. And I uplift sort of the work that SEAC is doing, because they have been amazing in leading the way to make sure that our elders are not forgotten.
Mm-hmm. One other thing, because Gina mentioned technology, I had spoken with Ethan over at Central Mass Agency on Aging, and they just completed a community needs assessment for the senior population. And, the issues that have been there, housing, transportation, food, insecurity, those remain. They've grown a little because of COVID, but the newest thing that they have seen is the technology, the access to technology, how to use it. So that is one thing, because everybody's doing the telehealth and keeping in touch that way, that's the biggest need that they've seen come out of since COVID started. Like I said, the others are still there. They've just been exacerbated, but technology is the newest need that they've seen come out of their needs assessment.
We definitely see equity issues play out in technology. That's been a long conversation. Absolutely. So thanks again for calling our attention to other demographics that are left behind in the way we currently have structured things. I do hope that the sort of all the pain we've gone through this pandemic results in some long-term change. It is really hard, I think, now for people to deny that things are not equitable, that people are being affected differently depending on their circumstances, and that's not really the city I want to live in. I know that's not the city Bill and Gina and Casey want to live in, right? Like, we want to live in a city that takes care of everybody. End of sentence. And so thanks again for showing us some ways we could do that. What is the best way for us to kind of get out this information to our networks? I know you said you're like a 2-woman show, and I know many of us are plugged into other networks professionally, personally. social networking. So what's going to be the most help for pushing things forward?
So like I mentioned, we have a food security group that has been meeting since the pandemic every Tuesday at 9 a.m. We talk about sort of these large policy and state. So it really is focused on the city of Worcester and the amazing work that people are doing and identifying gaps. So that's one. If you want, you can sign up to the Central Mass SNAP Coalition, which we chair. And it's all about SNAP and related sort of policies. The Food Policy Council meets the third Thursday of every month, and we talk about those issues. But in terms of like the two pieces of legislation that we're pushing, we're happy to send you the flyers with the login if people want to sign up as an organization, because it's important for us to put it on our one pager to say, look, this isn't just the Worcester County Food Bank, it's not just the Food Policy Council, but is look at all of these organizations that I really want to make sure that this policy goes through. And the second part is really call your representative. So it's not just the, the legal aid attorney or the Food Policy Council who has been bugging them and nudging them. And they will never say that we're bugging them. They always tell us, we love to hear from you. But we have the support of our Central Mass delegation, which is important. Nudge them. And if you live in other cities across the Commonwealth, it's really helpful for us if you also tell them as well. Like I said, it's over 6,000 bills that were filed. It's difficult to kind of get this one across. So how do we do that? And so it's about noise. And so the more noise that you make, the easier it is. We're hoping to have sort of like a live rally via Zoom in the upcoming weeks about these two bills. So we're gonna definitely, Amy, since we have your contact information, send out the invitation. So we get this. And Casey, we thanks to the food bank, we now have an intern working with us on this around social media. So we're hoping to get sort of the materials that we need to help, propel these two pieces of legislation. Casey, anything you would like to add?
I was just writing in the chat, but yeah, we'll send out follow information on how to sign on as an organization, and so you can have those links very easily available. You can have access to social media and letters to the media, as well as to representative templates. And so getting people support on this, I hope we made the case of the importance of policy. And so I think getting everyone's support and really pushing this momentum on these would really be helpful.
Thank you. Anyone else have comments, questions, thoughts? Mind blown? I don't know. Like, was it just me? Like the historical pieces of the of learning about kind of what the policy's sentiment was and how that leads to where we are today was definitely validating for what we see now. Yeah, and AJ, I don't know if you or Casey or anybody wants to speak to anything. The REC is doing some new initiatives, right, that are specifically designed for this time and getting people connected to benefits.
Oh, Amy, you just put me on the spot there.
I'm so glad you're here. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, so I was a bit late. No, thank you for everyone that's doing something, Worcester County Food Bank and the coalition, and I liked your comments, and good to see you here. Gina, hi again. Yeah, we're still working on our Hip to Go program,
right,
where people can sign up regionally, or can sign up for pickup from their home, and we'll provide the kind of food put together for them. We're still planning on doing our outdoor food farmers market program, where people can show up and use SNAP and HIP benefits to purchase healthy food. And people can also grow their own food. So we have resources for people to help grow their own food in their house. But the Hip to Go program is probably the sort of best way we're trying to address some of the food insecurity. So.
You did great with being on the spot. Thank you. All right. Well, if no one has anything else, thank you so much.
I have one more thing to add, sorry.
Oh, please,
So
yes.
Fallon has released their letter of intent for our community impact grant, and the funding priorities are food insecurity and then senior health initiatives. So I'll put the link in the chat. LOIs are due by the April 30th. And I'll put my email too. If anyone has any questions, they can reach out to me.
Thank you, Cheryl. That's really important work.
And I have something to add, please. So all foster children automatically qualify for WIC without the foster parents' income. And sometimes it's harder for people to take in babies. So if you know anyone, or if you could please spread the word, even if the baby is going to be with the family for a day, WIC provides the formula and the benefits. And I been through meetings and stuff, sometimes people are more hesitant to take in babies because formula is super expensive. Even if it's a special formula, WIC is required to provide that special formula. So if you could please get the word out about foster children and automatically qualifying for WIC. Thank you.
I have a question. How do we contact you?
I will put my contact information in the chat really quickly, please.
Oh yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Well, if that's it, thanks again. It was so helpful, and we're so grateful for the work you're doing. Obviously, the work you're doing is really impacting people in our community, and we can't thank you enough. Go Worcester. Love that foods program when you have so amazing. Yeah, so thanks again for your amazing work, and thank you so much to everybody who is here today. We really appreciate your caring and continued attention to people in need. So thanks again.
Thank you for having us.